Dear ambassadors, colleagues, friends, thank you for coming to this 18th session of the Coffees of the Secretary General, or Coffees with the Secretary General, rather. I'd like to thank the Ambassador of the United States, Daniel Yohannes, for his and his team's support in making this a reality for the championing the program of the groups of Friends of Inclusive Growth. As you know, those of you, maybe some of you don't know, Ambassador Yohannes is the chair of the group of Friends of Inclusive Growth, and we just had a meeting in New York with mayor champions for inclusive growth. But the ambassador said at some point, we are going to need to get the private sector get together and participate actively in terms of the inclusive growth strategy if we want to make it happen. And this is where our guest today comes in, because Peter Georgescu was uppermost in Ambassador Yohannes' mind when he was thinking about people who would be committed to this concept. Now, the purpose of this event, these coffees, is to bring to the OECD people that are working on relevant issues for the OECD from other trenches, from other approaches, other chemistry, to help us all enrich our perspective, refine our sensitivity, and improve our analysis and policy advice. In the ultimate instance, about policy. It's not a think tank, it's not a discussion, it's not a seminar, it's basically how do we improve our policy messaging and our policy advice. I'm happy to welcome Peter Georgescu, who you have been, now you're almost familiar, because it's been standing in there for about 2 or 3 weeks now, so everybody says, who is this guy? You know, so now he's this in the flesh. Huh? Chairman Emeritus of Young and Rubicon, author. His books like The Source of Success or The Constant Choice that I have here explore a new standard of leadership that focuses on the relationship between the informed customer and the creative employee. A relationship which he stresses must be built with honesty and integrity. He also recounts his life journey from childhood and his captivity in a Romanian labor camp, his father being taken off when he was about 2 years old by the dictatorship in Romania then, and then, of course, the trauma of the Soviet Russian occupation. And then, of course, all the way to his way to America, his role as CEO, and the convictions that goodness is not inherent, but that, as the book says, it's a constant choice. Every day you have to make it happen in a deliberate way. So Peter will tell us about his new book, actually. We just found out that Lami already had a manuscript there, but she hadn't shared it with us. So we found out by accident. She left it lying around. You know? It's called Capitalists Arise. So he'll tell you about it. But what I wanted to say in finishing this introduction is that the reason why we invited Peter is because Peter's whole approach is about what our ministerial is going to be. It's about, yes, business, yes, open markets, yes, making it happen in terms of growth, etc., but at the same time, by making sure that the individual, that the person, that the persons, that the families, the men and women, the children, etc., are front and center in the policy design. And this, of course, is what has been missing. So our nexus, the productivity inclusiveness nexus, our inclusive growth in cities, and hopefully very soon with Peter's support, our business champions for inclusive growth is what this is about. So thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Ambassador. You have the floor, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary General. I'm very delighted to be here. I thank you for that very thoughtful and kind introduction. Very warm, and I feel very much at home. After all, this is Paris. This is heaven on earth, so lucky me. The only thing I could do is to bring to Paris some good weather, so I do take credit for that. Thank you very much also to Ambassador Johannes, who reached out to me some months ago in New York, and he is responsible for starting this very meaningful and important relationship that I have with the OECD. And I also want to thank Lamia Kamal Chawi for her help in organizing and steering to arrive to this event today. So thank you, Lamia, as well. So I'm here in Paris to talk about inequality, or as you call it, the need for inclusive growth, because we're talking about the same thing. And we all know that this is an extraordinary challenge for all the nations and members of the OECD and far beyond. And I think we can also tell that inequality of income, which leads to inequality of opportunity, is a real serious threat, because it is in fact a threat to our way of life. It's a threat to our civil society. It is in fact unjust, immoral, and indeed unsustainable. And I am taking my hat off to the OECD for being the forefront of this crisis. You have, rang the bell. You have the research and the amazing data to diagnose the problem and to reach out to initiatives. And as the Secretary General mentioned, what happened a couple of weeks ago in New York was a very important step in this direction. Now, what I'm going to do in my presentation this morning is to look at the business sector for two purposes. I want to understand and share with you what I believe is the culpability of the business in this area, and secondly, to also point to important areas where potential and dramatic solutions in helping this crisis can be found. I also think that, as the title says, we capitalists must arise because we have the capacity and honestly should have the wisdom and the urgency to bring solutions to this socioeconomic crisis. And actually, we need to agree that a change in our behavior, a real change in the way we do business, is going to become essential, and that we must act with urgency. There's good news, and the good news is that I think we can have the confidence that if we do act wisely and urgently, the probability is very high that the solutions will bode well for the future of growth in general and of prosperity as well. Now, my presentation will focus exclusively on the United States for many reasons, because I know something about the United States, and secondly, because it is a market where the problem is perhaps the most severe, surprisingly, in the world today, and that the understanding the U.S. will inform other markets, other members of the OECD countries and beyond. So indeed, I think it's time for us capitalists to arise. And we must arise for a very important purpose, and that is to preserve free enterprise capitalism. And I say that because free enterprise capitalism today is at risk, and the consequences of potentially losing our growth engine, to me, is about as catastrophic as you can to our way of life and to our business success. And we know that the free market capitalist engine can work and has worked amazingly well. examples, if you look at the period from right after the war to the late 1970s, this engine has created America as a leading economic and military power, and very critically important, has created the most amazingly powerful middle class economically. A middle class market which in fact provided the fuel for America's economic success. And miraculously, the principles of free enterprise capitalism has helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty. If you think about India and China or Brazil or parts of Africa, amazing things have happened to produce more humane standards of living around the world. But enter the crisis of income and wealth inequality. And what we're seeing, surprisingly, is that this free enterprise capitalist system of today doesn't seem to be working. It's not addressing the problem. So there are many countervailing economic, political, and social forces marshalling around which threaten the viability of free market capitalism. And that is obviously a very great concern at two levels. One, the engine used to work, and secondly, the engine is not working anymore. So this presentation really wants to do three things. First, I want to really define with certainty or raise the question that is income and wealth inequality really as serious a problem as we are making it to be? Because in order for us to really, really force change, we must be sure that we are solving a worthy problem. The second point is to understand the reasons for why the free market capitalism of today is not working. What's different about this free market capitalism? And if we understand that, perhaps we can reimagine, that's the third part, to reimagine what free market capitalism can and should do in order to provide solutions to this crisis. Before I get right into the presentation, I want to give a couple of comments of context. In discussion with other business leaders, people are saying, well, what's wrong about inequality? Inequality is okay. We're all unequal, aren't we? We're born unequal, our life's journeys are unequal, so why are we getting so exasperated about this problem? So when does inequality become a serious issue? And I suggest that it becomes a serious issue when not just a few people, we've always had inequality of some rich people in an agrarian economy or the robber barons or whatever throughout histories in different nations, different cultures. They've always been wealthy, unequal folks. But when you have a large swath, a large minority of people where the economic power of the nations is concentrated in that group and not on the vast majority of Americans or whatever the nationality may be, when that disparity gets to be too large, that's when something bad happens. And the bad thing that happens is that each nation has a contract, an implicit or explicit contract with its citizens about how a standard of living applies to all of the citizens. And in America, that started with the Jeffersonian idea of pursuit of happiness and of property, which said that is a right for all the citizens of America. And if you translate that in modern lingo, that says that's equality of opportunity to be the very best that I can be given my resources and my intelligence and my industry. And when that contract gets broken, when that opportunity no longer exists, then we have problems. The second kind of objections that I get is if there's an economic problem, the market will fix it. The market fixes everything. Mm-hmm. It's this unwise hand that governs the universe and fixes problems. So I went looking for the market, and I couldn't find it. I even looked in the ether, and I couldn't find it in the ether, for goodness sakes. So I'm trying to say that the market is something else, that the market is, again, an explicit and sometimes implicit sort of agreement on how business is conducted. What are the rules of the game that are acceptable at any one point in time? Because we know that free market is never really totally free. There are legal constraints. The banks, when they loan money, have covenants, and government has all kinds of regulations and protectionist stuff or anti-protectionist stuff, and that there's some moral, ethical, secular understandings of how we behave, trust, honesty, corruption, and all those things. So the free market notion becomes important to understand later on in the presentation, the difference between maybe what the free market called acceptable back when and what the free market is saying is acceptable today. Okay, this is perhaps the only real serious chart that I would argue is defines for me the problem in the United States. And before you go look at it, try to understand it, let me explain it, please. This is sort of a yearning that I had to understand what is the level of inequality, because people say, well, $40,000 or $50,000, that's a problem. That defines inequality. And I said, I don't intuitively get that. So what I wanted to do, and I finally found the answer, is to say this. What happens to a household? And this is household data. What happens to a household at the end of the month and at the end of the year? Because then I understand when there's a serious problem. If there's nothing left at the end of the month after you paid all your bills, then you have a problem. So that's what this analysis tries to do. On the income side, it takes all wages, salaries, all the entitlements, Social Security, unemployment benefits, food stamps, extras from state subsidies or federal government, fully loaded income. On the expense side, you take away taxes, and every bill, whether it's food, transportation, education, vacations, whatever it is, everything gets taken out. And so what are you left at the end of the day? Some level of discretionary surplus income used for whatever you want, maybe a better standard of living, maybe investment, maybe savings, whatever. So what does it show? It shows that about 55% of America at the end of each month is broke. Technically broke. They have to borrow money to put food on the table. And this debt is beginning to accumulate because you can't pay it out. And that's the flip side, as we'll talk about, of wealth. You borrow money, and being poor is very expensive because when you borrow money, the rates, not only credit card rates, but you borrow money in the black market, and the rates are about 100 to 400% annual interest rates. So if you go all the way through the sixth decile, this is a decile analysis, I should have said, 10 equal homes around. So you look at the sixth decile, and that's break even, $41 at the end of the month. So we have no middle class in America, right? That's gone. That previous chart that I said, free market capitalism built the middle class in America. There's no more middle class in America. And the upper middle class is your sixth and seventh deciles, averaging together, brings you about $8,500 a year. That's what's left over at the end of the year, not a month, a year. And so for that, you're supposed to save with that, invest with that, have a better standard of living. The old middle class used to have a kid or two in private schools, 2 cars, maybe a cabin by a mountains or by a lake or the seaside, $8,500 a year. You know, a serious problem with your car, or God forbid an illness, or the roof leaks. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz stated that 4 out of 5 Americans in their lifetimes will experience some form of poverty. And this data proves that. It's very consistent with that. And the upper 20% of us, we're doing fine. Life is as good as it gets. Thank you very much. It's good. So serious problems here. I'm not going to spend much time with this. This shows that America, if you look at the vertical axis, we're talking about immobility, the ability to move from the last, if you will, social status to the top in one generation. And on the vertical axis, you have the Gini coefficient, or a form of inequality, income inequality. And America, unfortunately, is at the top of the major markets in the OECD, or countries, if you will. I think Chile is really at the top. I didn't put it up. I apologize to Chile. Okay, let's talk about wealth. This is research data. And the folks at Duke University went out and did some actual research and asked people, what is the ideal distribution of wealth, in your opinion, what should be in America? And they said, well, the top 20%, which is your red bar, should have more than their share, maybe around 30+% of the wealth in America. That would be ideal. Then they asked them, what do you think is happening today? They said, well, today is not so good, you know. The top 20% owns a lot more than that. Let's say they own almost 60% of the wealth in America. That's what they think is happening today, okay? But then, here's the reality. The 20% of America owns about 90% of the wealth in America. And that's a problem because, as I said, the flip side of that is debt. And secondly, wealth concentration of wealth in a small group of people, 20% is still relatively small. It reduces investment because rich people don't spend money, they don't consume. And secondly, obviously, if you had some wealth, when you got into the problem, you could protect yourself against mental or health issues, or a car breaking down, or whatever the problem may be. But there's no wealth. The wealth is in the top 20%. So what are the consequences now of this socioeconomic problem of inequality? Well, I start with education. It's really a disaster because in America, public education is paid by real estate taxes, property taxes. So poor, small houses, no education. The wife of my co-writer is a teacher, a second-grade teacher in Rochester, New York. And every year, at the beginning of the year, she goes to classrooms with a bushel fulls of pads, papers, and pencils and pens, because the school nor the parents have money to pay for the fundamentals of learning. And they copy books, textbooks, in order to be able to, for the kids to have materials to learn from. This is what's happening in many zip codes, and by zip codes I mean postal areas that are happening, because that's what inequality is. It's not the north or south or east or west. It's right next door. So people can hear the music at the wonderful country club across the railroad tracks. So they're really, it's a close communities right next door. You have the problems. So terrible education, which means dropout rates 60 to 70% out of the lycée, out of the high schools. And those few who get to college drop out very quickly because they're not academically prepared to stay in there, or socially, for that matter. They can't stay and be able to compete with the rest of the 20%ers. And so I'm talking about something called cortisol, which fascinated me. Cortisol, I'm vice chairman of a large hospital, so I got into, and neurology is an area of interest. Cortisol is a hormone that's produced in the brain, and basically what it does, it sort of tames down the cognitive skill set, the executive kind of capability where we are right now. And instead of that, in situation of stress, family stress at home, whatever, for these kids, it produces the fight or flight syndrome. And so the kids go there all angry, underfed, and they're supposed to learn. It cannot be done. Anyway, by the way, there's no early education in most of those zip codes. There is plenty of early education for those 20%ers and our kids. Not theirs. And you know, if you don't put your kids to some form of early education by the age of 3, they just can't compete. By the time they get to the first grade or 6 or 7, you've lost the game. Single-parent homes, a mom usually has 2 jobs. There's never a dinner to talk about with the kids at home at night. So where do they learn about, where did they get the support for academics, for school problems, for peer problems, for how you deal with life, for ethics and morality of what's right and what's wrong, and how you deal with all those issues? It's a scary thing. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, galore, crime. Coates, African-American writer, grew up in New Orleans, and cities like New Orleans and Chicago and others, black on black sometimes. Crime is horrific, and he writes about the amount of time and energy he has to spend trying to figure out the route he has to take to go to grandma's house and make sure that he's not going to get in trouble along the way. It's real problems. Lack of jobs, galore. Unemployment, yes, the 5% is pretty good of those who are looking for jobs, but so many people have stopped looking for jobs, so there's structural unemployment that's probably close to 15+% in America today. There's a dramatic drop in life expectancy, particularly among white males. And if you take the top 1% life expectancy and the bottom 1% life expectancy, the delta is 15 years of life. So all this stuff has consequences on life. So simple, current version of free enterprise is not helping all Americans. We've established the income inequality, vanishing middle class. This is the problem. This socioeconomic situation is creating an India-style caste system. It's very tough to get out of this. Poor education leads, it all mushrooms together. And it's very hard unless you run very fast or jump very high and you're a great athlete or something, or a genius that somebody recognizes. And that's the ultimate problem, the creation of grossly unequal opportunity for most citizens in America. That's the net problem. This is the thing that breaks the contract within the nation. Just briefly on a couple of major conclusions here. There's nothing systemic in our business environment today that does anything but drive inequality further and further apart every day. Nothing exists that says that can bridge this gap today as business is being conducted. Nothing. This is the writings of Ariel and Will Durant in the 1960s said, the world has seen this problem before, folks. And it's always consistently, 100% consistently, the problem gets solved in one and two ways. You either redistribute wealth, as the marvelous French economist Piketty said, and I think he spoke here, through punitive taxation. Well, if you call 80% marginal tax rate punitive, I think it is. That's one way to do it. And we also sadly know that in reality, it may be economically in theory works, it doesn't work in practice. Wealth redistribution never works. You have to teach people how to fish. You can't just give them fish and hope that's sustainable. But the second area is you redistribute poverty. And it happened in France in the 1800s. It happens with the Bolsheviks. And I know something about that. As the Secretary General said, I was in a work camp for about 5 years as a youngster. And it happened in Cuba, and it happened in Venezuela, and it happened in the Arab Spring in the Middle East, and so forth. And we're seeing bubbling in Paris and bubbling in many cities in America. All kinds of demonstrations, this and that. And at some point in time, there's a kindling point where worse things are going to happen. And there's therefore a rejection of the free enterprise growth as a system of fixing our economic problems, because look at what he's created, and therefore it's no good. So finding a solution important for business is critical, and therefore business needs to lead the way. I'm not going to spend much time on the causes of inequality because you know it. The only thing I wanted to point out, Walmart had the highest market cap in America until about 6-9 months ago when Amazon took over. Walmart employed 2.1 million people, Amazon 150,000. So you understand the problem. lots of political decision, always favoring the wealthy, not just the wealthy, but the managerial classes, the owners versus the employees who worked. Unions have lost bargaining power. Unions have failed in America for sure to fight the relevant battles. They've always fought the relevant battles. They always thought that the management was the enemy. They didn't say, let's get together and create a bigger pie to share. So they've been losing out in the private sector. The financial crisis, and the last thing is shareholder primacy. And I'm going to focus most of the attention because we can't do a whole lot about technology and globalization other than to say that both of them can be friends, not just enemies, if we put our minds to it. Nobody's asking technology to say, hey, how can we help create more jobs for more people? We ask technology to do lots of things, but so far we haven't asked them to say, hey, can we think about how technology can be used? And now I'm going to give you some examples later on. Who can fix the problem? Well, governments can for sure contribute a lot. Not so much in America because for the last 8 years we've had this crisis of two parties fighting each other, and nothing comes out of Congress, nothing. So in America, at least, business is the only institution that has a chance, has an opportunity to begin to create solutions and the solutions will take a journey. And the ultimate, of course, is the government and private industry to collaborate together, and that's where we hope to end up. But let's understand, why did I say that this extraordinary free market capitalism was really working? What was it about it that was different than it may be today? And I'll talk about what it exactly is today. But what was it and what worked? Well, it worked because the modern American corporation was built on 5 critical stakeholders. First was the customer, because without the customer, obviously, nothing good ever happens. And secondly is the employees. After all, a company was invented, created by society to help society produce what they needed a little bit more efficiently and more simply and more productively. So that was how companies got started. Third, the shareholders, of course, who in those days produced the major difference, which was money. The corporation itself needs to be fed. The corporation is very important, but it needs to be fed in order to sustain itself over time, to stay relevant over time. It needs investment. And they used to invest in corporations. And the communities, of course, in which they did business. Corporations got huge tax advantages to be good citizens in the community, to take care of the communities and be a very positive force in that community. And at its best, free enterprise capitalism was not only fair but responsible, but it optimized, not maximized, but optimized all 5 stakeholders. And that's what was magical about the 30-year period, and it worked like a Stradivarius violin. And as late as the 1980s, the Chamber of Commerce definition of the role of business was to create jobs. The role of business was to create jobs in the economy and to pay people fairly. That's what was then. I'm not going to read through that except to point a few things. This is a marvelous document. If you haven't seen it, as most of you have not, I urge you, because you'll find it on the internet. This is the Johnson & Johnson Credo, written in 1946 by General Johnson, who was one of the founders of Johnson & Johnson Company, the pharmaceutical company. And it's an example of what it took for business to do it right. It starts by saying, we believe the first responsibility of a corporation, of our corporation, is to the doctor, the nurses, the patients, the mothers and fathers, in other words, the employee, it's the customer. And say we have to produce good quality products, and we have to produce them at a good price, and we have to really care for our customers. The second responsibility is to the employees, the men and women who work throughout the world for us. You must consider them and respect them and care for them and feed them and make sure that their families are well taken care of, vacations are being paid for, etc. And then the last sentence, I love the last sentence, says, we must provide competent management. We, the corporation, must provide competent management And that management and their action must be just and fair. The third area is all about communities and how you should take good care of the communities. And the last sentence and the last paragraph says, when we operate according to these principles, the shareholder or the stockholder, it says, should realize a fair return. Now, that's the practical application of those things that I talked about before. So you have to ask yourself, are we doing that today? The answer is no, we're not. Why? Because business, I say the free market capitalism got hijacked. I use the term deliberately, hijacked. And as a consequence, business has become a major contributor to income inequality, and the shareholder primacy is eroding market value. This is a cancer. What we have here in shareholder primacy is a cancer that's eating the heart of the society and the heart of the corporation itself. And I say that because shareholder primacy means, in reality, that 90 cents out of every dollar of profit goes to the shareholder. And here are the innards of our system today. Amazingly, profits are at all-time high. Profits today are at all-time high. Never mind the fact that there's a depressed worldwide economy, that it's tough to make sales, etc. Profits are all-time high. How'd you get there? Well, we were talking about productivity before. This chart goes from the Second World War all the way in terms of productivity is the red line, the blue line is hourly compensation. And you see how it was really basically one line through pretty much most of the 1970s. And then from the 1970s, or rather the 1980 on, wages flatlined. So for the last 40 years, this is not a new problem. This is a 40-year problem, right? Wages barely keep up with inflation, as you folks know very well. And if the productivity line, also you can talk about the shareholder return line, same kind of stuff. That way it ends in 1910, but productivity has lessened a little bit in the last few years. But wages have not moved. That's the point. So that's one of the reasons that profits have gone up so much. That's how we have profits where they are today. So as a result, the share of labor as a percentage of gross domestic product, or GDP, is down. Investment in business is down. This is shareholder primacy. We're not going to invest in a lot in R&D because we're going to return 90 cents out of every dollar. What about doing basic research and publishing basic research? In the U.S., our share market went from almost 80% down to about 6% in 2007. And that foretold, by the way, that foretells future creativity and innovation. In terms of simple R&D, if you look in terms of competitive R&D investment, you see that we are in a pretty sad competitive position. And this is not an issue for all business. It's an issue for public corporations. Private corporations, and the three bars are just the first bar, or set of two bars, red being public, is the fact that first it's all, the first set of bars, it's for all businesses, then they match them. So no matter how you look at it, private companies do better. I'm going to skip this chart and get to the punchline. How do we do all of this? It's financial engineering. This is financial engineering. Stock buybacks is the major solution. As we were saying, money is almost free, so you borrow almost free. You use free money to buy back your stock. So total return is price earnings. So it's earnings over the number of shares. So if you can't drive earnings, what do? You decrease your denominator. You decrease the number of shares that you have. And bingo, you have the highest profit margins in history. And by the way, the stock buybacks are the highest level of stock buybacks in history as well. And excessive cash dividends. But that said, there's also hoarding cash. Business today are hoarding at least $1 trillion every year in various places in the marketplace, and that $1 trillion is not subject to taxation in most markets. And so we have money to pay people more, We have money to invest in the corporation for their own future if we want to, but we don't. Because the market, remember the definition of the market says that you have to return to shareholders every quarter more total shareholder return, which is your price-earnings ratio has to go up. So therefore, keeping cash is okay, because all they care about is the price-earnings ratios, right? So we have money to pay, we choose not to do that. We choose to keep it hidden, whatever. How did this happen? I'm not going to go through the long chronology of these things in the interest of time, but it did begin to happen in the late 1970s, and lots of problems, and the wealthy really took control of their own destinies, because the well-educated people were the people who, and the children of the people who were the managers and the owners, and they used pressure and bought their way to all kinds of entitlements. We have a tax code that's full of entitlements for the rich. That's extraordinary. Extraordinary. People don't pay taxes. As we know, for the famous last election, when our presidential candidates didn't want to reveal how much tax they really paid because it was under 10%. And there's some corporations in America, including General Electric, that don't pay, they pay zero taxes in America. So that's what happened over time, over those 40 years that I talked about. And then there was the justification by Milton Friedman. He was the great theologian of American business. In 1980, he said that the role of business is to increase shareholder value. And that morphed into what is today's mantra. Today's market definition of the rules of the game is to maximize short-term shareholder value, with the emphasis on those two terrible words, maximizing short-term. And that's the problem. That is the definition of why shareholder primacy doesn't work. But that's where we are, folks. Like it or not, that's where we are. And the justification today is very simple. The shareholders are corporations' owners, and therefore they're entitled to get maximum returns at any time. Okay? So who's executing that? The CEOs. And these very aggressive shareholders who care for every penny that is being spent, except that not when you pay CEOs, because the CEOs are needed to deliver the short-term results, right? So during those marvelous years, the golden era was defined, the ratio of CEO to average employee was 20-1. Today, it's actually, right now, that's almost all. It's now north of 700-1 on average. And if you don't do that, you get fired. So the tenure of the CEO is under 4 years of age, which is ridiculous. So no wonder you get this constant churning or short-term mentality, because the new CEO coming in says, I know what happened to my predecessor. He didn't deliver short-term, so he's gone, and I better not do that because I like my plane and I like my money, and I don't blame him. 4 years. The CMO is the chief marketing officer. They've got to produce increase in revenues. Very tough in today's world, and that's why they result in stock buybacks. But they get fired every 2 years. So a question should arise and say, is the shareholder an owner? Well, they come into an equity when they want, they leave when they want. Do owners behave that way? Then the shareholder is immune to all corporate liabilities and problems. Owners? No. There's no legislation ever that says that the shareholder is an owner. So that's a myth, a total myth. The last point is the activist role. There's a new segment of activists. The original activists I support, and I think it's great. They're an important governance role. Managements cannot be allowed to go to sleep, so the activist shareholders work with managements, give them ideas, give them thoughts, etc. They even can take over the company, but they take over the company with the idea to hold, because then there's value that needs to be unleashed. And they hang in there to take advantage of that. And then Warren Buffett says our favorite holding period is forever. Because we buy a good company and we expect managements to keep on investing in the business to keep it going into perpetuity. And that can be done. And then there's a new negative group, I call them the terrorists, activists, and that's what they are, because they also blackmail. They strip and flip. I'm sure you're familiar with this. They come and fire a whole bunch of people. They take the cash out. They take their profits out, and they leave. They don't hold, they leave. And then they not only do that, they create part of this zeitgeist. Part of the mantra is to say to companies, look, CEO, I'm not sure we like what you're doing. You're not growing fast enough. You better start to fire people. You better do what we would do, because if you don't do it, we'll come in and take care of it and fire you and keep doing it ourselves. So you've got this kind of constant fear that when I talk to some of my colleagues who are running businesses today, they say, I get killed if I try to do something different. So it's a problem. So now we can take a breath. But there's value in here, because if we truly understand in depth the problem, the solution begins to write itself. It's always the case, and at least in most cases. There may be exceptions. In most cases, if you really understand the problem, other than life itself, you know what the solution is. We haven't figured that yet. But I think we pretty much can tell what needs to be done. First of all, I am a capitalist at heart, meaning I believe in the free market engine of drive, that the free market and the profit motive can be very, very healthy. But we have to change our behavior in the culture of shareholder primacy. That is a disaster. That's a cancer. That is a bad thing. And the management's, the board of directors' fiduciary responsibility must be to optimize the interests of all those 5 stakeholders. Now, it's very critical to understand in the 21st century that the value creators are not the CEOs, are not the C-suite. The value creators are the employees. That's a fact. Capital today is cheap. In fact, capital can even cost you money if you put it in the wrong banks. So capital is not the differentiator. No. What drives the future of businesses is innovation and creativity. And so corporations have to invest in the value creators, and they have to pay the value creators the fair amount of money. And that's part of the problem. We have no middle class because the middle class isn't being paid. As you saw, the wages have flattened out. The middle class has disappeared. So I'm saying it's not just a question of generosity, it's a question of fairness. And the employees should share in the rate of productivity innovation increases. That's what I mean by fair pay. Share in the incremental increases of productivity and innovation. And I believe in a higher minimum wage, a living wage, but I don't believe in a single number, because a single number is always wrong somewhere. But living wage, and you know that in different parts of the world and different parts of the United States, a living wage can be something different. We have to invest in training and retraining. Hundreds of thousands of jobs go unfilled in America today because the people don't have the skills to fulfill the needs that are already there. And employees must be trained to delight customers. And if you fly anywhere in America on some of our wonderful American airlines, you understand the lack of customer care and support. And it's certainly not a delightful experience. Okay. The corporation, therefore, have to invest in innovation and give brands sustained. What makes a brand? That's another long conversation, but there are 2 things that drive a brand: differentiation and relevance. Not only in perception, I'm talking about in the product itself. You can't fool people. Maybe you never could. At least maybe you can fool them once, but that's about it. You got to be real. So that calls for investments to keep creating a differentiation versus competition. And that takes money, investment, and we know that's not going on today. So that's the other part of the equation that we know has to happen. And managements have to be held accountable for measuring the strength and value of the brand. And I know you can measure brands because we did it when I was CEO at Young Rubicam. We have the data. We know the methodology to do it. And so you have to be invested because a brand is an annuity. It keeps on giving over time, but you got to feed it. You've got to be strong. Right now, brands are being milked because they all want short-term results. So investing in R&D develops new businesses, which creates new jobs. You remain globally competitive, and you're able to take advantage of technology to force to create more jobs and more prosperity. I say the CEOs have to be evaluated and paid for more than just with shares. They have to have sustained profitability. They have to focus on margins. The new norm, you got to balance the 5 stakeholders, as we said. You have to improve the underlying assets and so forth. Invest over time. Now, you may think that I'm an anti-shareholder guy, and I'm not. I'm not. I like shares to return capital, and I like to see shares grow. A good friend of mine, his name is Jack Dick-Sheff. He's at the University, Emory University in Atlanta today. He took 40 companies. He termed them firms of endearment. There's such a book. And they do all the things right. So he looked over a 15-year period of time, and amazing what he found, that the firms of endearment beat the pants of the real market. So here's the irony, the ridiculousness of shareholder primacy. It doesn't work very well. Even for the short term, on a 5-year return, the firms of endearment do better. And it stands to reason. You pay people more, you invest in R&D, of course the business is going to go more. It stands to reason. So this is the stupidity of our current shareholder primacy strategy. It's ruinous, and at the same time, it doesn't work very well. Lots of good companies that stand up straight and take care of their people and invest in R&D. Longer term, create new jobs. It's critical. In America, it's easy. It's not difficult to do if we have the will to do it, if government can help do that. Education is essential. Long term, you cannot have equality of opportunity without improved education. We must worry about education, both in terms of secondary education and in terms of higher education. And we must provide early education for all our children. And we have to be humble and have the humility to say, hey, around the world, the trade school system works. And we better learn from that because we need it. We need to match the future skill sets of tomorrow with some capability, training capability so people can get good jobs. And so we can evolve to, but before I go to the summary, let me talk about one other thing in the importance of partnerships between the government and industry. Take the healthcare industry. Governments, plural, have invested colossal amount of money in decoding the DNA. And then once the DNA was decoded, private industry came in and monetized those innovations, and magic happened. Today we have hundreds of thousands of jobs, probably millions of jobs around the world, high-paying jobs, because governments have made originally huge investments. And that's the kind of partnership we're talking about. Or how about the internet? It was a creation of the government. And you look at the previous charts, you look at all the great, powerful companies, and it's not just the Googles and the Apples and the Facebooks and Microsofts and that, but hundreds of thousands of little companies in France and in Germany and all across Europe and in America and whatever you want to look, that are in the digital world of today and tomorrow. It's powerful stuff. So the point is we need to evolve to a fair, more just, more relevant free market capitalism. That's the solution. So I am a capitalist. I want to win. I want to win the right way. And I want to avoid having to be taxed to death to solve the problem. because that's not a wise long-term thing to do. Or, God forbid, I don't want to have pitchforks in the streets to tell us what to do. So the overall summary is obvious. We have to get away from income inequality and the loss of opportunity that has to be eliminated. And we have to give people jobs. You cannot have sustained citizenship that is a contributor without jobs. People need the rewards and the self-esteem and the dignity of having jobs. And I disagree with people like Robert Gordon, who says, well, the problems that I just showed you before are insurmountable, so America's or Britain's or France's or whatever, Germany's good days are behind them. That's not true, because business can and should take the lead short term to act, because business has the most to win and the most to lose if we don't do that. And if you were to tie me in an elevator and say, okay, Peter, by the 15th floor, you got to tell me what you're going to do, I'll say, pay higher wages, create more jobs, reimagine education. And that's what can get to equal opportunity for all Americans, which was, the American dream was that, equal opportunity. I know about that because I got it as an immigrant. I was 15 years old when I got to the States. I had nothing. We need to get CEOs and the boards of directors, equity holders, and the pension funds, and enlightened labor leaders. And by God, we need media to be our ally. Media has got to stop talking about all this negativity and all these scandals around. And how about celebrating all the good things that people can do to create solutions, so we can change the culture from negativity to positivity, to really get people excited, to get everybody pulling together. What are the barriers? I got to tell you, there's a lot of ignorance. Now, what I said to you, you know a lot of this data, obviously, but I brought it there to really knock shareholder primacy. That's why I did that, to say we've got to create the reality of fear, because this is not made-up stuff. We're going to get into a problem. And there's a lot of arrogance among business leaders about what's really going on. They're too busy creating their own business. They're disconnected, and I'll talk about this in one moment. Of course, we're also arrogant because we have so much power. We control the lives of thousands and thousands of people. We know everything, right? Then there's greed in all of us, part of the human condition. We got to try to control that. And lastly, lack of courage, or let's put it positively, we need more courage. We need business leaders to stand up, as some of them do. We need more of them to stand up and say, what we got here is broke. And in this case, if it broke, you better fix it. Mm-hmm. So we need people to have a dose of courage, will be a helpful thing. And then there's an overall principle that I said here. There's a sense that business can operate in a center of the universe disconnected from society. That society doesn't matter, that the consequences of a business are not relevant to the business world. They just do business, maximize business, and so forth. So I say that principle has to change, that business success and the community and nation success are connected, because it's obvious that they do. You cannot have a successful business without successful business. You cannot have a successful community without successful business. You cannot sustain a business without successful society. And we got to buy that principle. The future, as I said, can be terrific, but we need the will to do it. By the way, we have all the resources. We know how to do this. And I think it can be done, and I think we better do it and act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Peter. We have time for a couple of questions and comments or violent objections, which you may want to pose. Please feel free. Yes, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. First of all, I want to say thank you, Peter. These are very powerful presentations. I mean, look at the numbers. It should scare everyone. he's done a great job both in terms of addressing the concerns and also a way forward. Also want to thank you, Peter, for being a great leader and advocate for income inequality, because it is an issue, it is a concern of President Obama. And then also you see it manifest in our political processes today in the United States. I think some of the leaders that have come are not necessarily traditional leaders, but those that are supporting the concerns of those that are underprivileged and those that are concerned. So having said that, I also believe that business is a great partner, it could be a great partner, and I too have spoken to a lot of business leaders and I've gotten a lot of pushback. Some told me to go away because I was trying to create class warfare. There's some that really understand that they must do something about it. But Peter, what is the experience? I mean, this is not sustainable. So how could we get the majority of businesses to really accept and understand this is in their interest, this is in our interest? Right. What needs to happen?
Peter, would you allow me to take maybe 2 or 3 and then you can bring them together? Yes, Stefano?
Well, thank you, Secretary General, and thank you very much, Peter. This was a very interesting presentation. Thank you really for being with us and to share your thoughts with us. I very much like your strong focus on the bottom-up approach, making the business case for the need to tackle inequality. I think I have, if I can, Secretary General, 2 very much related questions. One is very much along the lines of what Ambassador Johannes was saying. How do we basically engineer the change? I mean, how do we move away from this syndrome of maximization of short-term shareholder value? How do we make this enlightened business that you were sort of highlighting on your slide becoming more and having a bigger voice? And related to that is, how can the OECD help? I think one of the points you made is that basically present the evidence, right? Stress the need that this system, the situation is not sustainable. Raise the fear that capitalism itself is at risk if we don't tackle inequality of income and wealth. What do you think we should do more, better? What are the key levers we can sort of highlight more in order to sort of strengthen this awareness of the unsustainability of the current situation? You know the work we have done. I mean, you have mentioned that yourself, looking at the distribution of income, distribution of wealth, the fact that the inequality is not good for economic growth, looking at the lack of social mobility in very unequal society, and so on and so forth. What do you think, from your perspective, to strengthen this business case, we should do? Thank you.
Another comment or question?
Here
yes, over here.
Thanks. Just real quick, I loved your comments about capitalism in general. As a former financial reporter and somebody who deals with media here, I spent a lot of time, once upon a time, interviewing the spokesman of capitalism, if you will. Do you worry about that? Do you worry about the cult of the CEO in any economy? And to what degree can we start to change who the spokespeople are of capitalism?
Let me just close with, was it? Oh, yes, please, okay.
Lastly, I just wanted to mention the OECD corporate governance principles. We in this House very much buy into your mantra about stakeholder value and maximizing returns for all stakeholders. The question is that we have also spoken of incentives to shareholders and the fact that we need to be able to attract shareholders, let them stay in the company, not vote with their feet, and also pay managers. So now, what can trigger the change that you are speaking of, given that the rhetorics are probably even there, but you're not following?
And last but not least, all this money is sitting in there, and it's not being invested, it's being used to do buybacks, to do mergers, not to create new sources of wealth, but and you mostly focused on the business, but clearly that's there's a few policy issues there, having to do with taxes, having to do with the whole approach of governments to the business world and creating the right incentives. So you have the floor.
Okay. Yes, it is. Thank you. Yes, it is a complicated issue, for sure. I just want to explain, not justify and excuse, but explain the fact that this avalanche of awareness of income inequality is about 18 months old. When I started to work on this book, there was nothing in the media, nothing, I mean zero in the media in the U.S. About it. So this is a relatively new thing. So people are just beginning to, and now there's a drumbeat, a big drumbeat is building, as it should be. We should have been talking about this 10 years ago, not just today. But it is what it is. So we're just starting. So there's an education process here that we have to understand that has to take place. And that's in essence the presentation that I made today was not made for you. This is really a presentation made for my kin, my colleagues, my CEO friends. And to dramatize the importance of it, and I wanted you folks to understand that some of us get it, and some of us, I'm here also asking for help. And I think that we can collaborate together, and I'm not the only one. There are some wonderful, powerful leaders in America who feel the same way as I do. And so we need to marshal them together. We need to organize them together. And one is trying to do that. I've written an op-ed with one of a very conservative a business leader. His name is Ken Langone, and he's as conservative as you can get. So this is not an issue of the liberals against the conservatives. It's the conservative. This is us capitalists saying we all need to save this system, and this system cannot go on very long. So, yeah, change is going to be hard, folks. This is going to be a long struggle. I'm not fooling myself. I know. Changing persuasions and sort of attitudes is hard. Changing behavior is harder. But that's how we have to do it. We have to change first the understanding of the situation, the belief in the situation, then eventually we have to change behavior. I wish I can tell you that there's a silver bullet that we can do it. It isn't. We just got to go, as they say, bayonets in hand, trench by trench by trench, group by group by group, we have to do it. And I think, we all have to play different roles. I think the Secretary General is right. We have to get the governments to play in here. There's government policies. There's monetary policy that's absolutely critical in here. And today what we're doing is wrong. There's fiscal policy in governments that is, particularly in the United States, that's outrageous. I will tell you that if you look at what has happened politically in the U.S., you had one form of the government, which is the White House, that has been trying heroically and accomplishing a great deal. For example, as the Affordable Care Act was an example of that, was a fantastic accomplishment to help people mostly to poor people, to get them access to health care that they didn't have before, and the preconditions that they couldn't buy insurance. If you had a cancer, God forbid, beforehand, you couldn't buy another insurance. If you got fired and your old insurance policy was canceled, we couldn't get another insurance. And sometimes these are devastating illnesses, the issues. So a lot has been accomplished already. But the reason of fiscal policy, we had a Congress that was at a deadlock, and nothing could happen. In fact, they fought tooth and nail everything that the president has done. So we accomplished a lot. There's a lot more to do, and so we have to work at lots of people in lots of ways. But here comes the notion of education, and I think I'm glad that you brought the issue of media up, because, again, media has to inform. We have to create an awareness deep down in the bowels of our populations for them to understand the problem, because we have to elect the right people to go to Washington and to Paris and to all the capitals of the developed nations to say, we want people who get it. So we have a responsibility to really work at policy level and to communicate the understanding of the problem deeply into the media and deeply into the population so people can elect the right people to governments. And by the way, to your question about who are leading corporations today, and I'll tell you, there are too many places where the leadership of corporate whatever, OECD, the leaders of the corporations within the OECD, too many of them are all financial engineers or lawyers. That's who runs corporations today, on balance. It's not the business builder, it's not the marketing types, it's not the engineering types, it's the technocrats who bought into the system and perpetuate the system. And so the next generation of leaders will be a different kind of a leader who will understand the responsibility they have to all those 5 stakeholders that I mentioned, including the community, including the employees and so forth, who understand the consequences, who understand the importance that society must win. You cannot have business win and society lose. That's no longer in the 21st century. It's not a viable proposition. So I'm saying here, this is a struggle, this is a journey, and the good news is it can have a very happy ending. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter Georgescu, a survivor, survivor of dictatorship, a survivor of Russian invasions, a survivor also of illness, eh? Yeah. And also a great success in the world of business itself, and a great, as you now see, a great source and force for inspiration and for the ambition within the open market concept that we all believe in, but of a much better way of organizing things. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Hey, thank you. Hey.